Your mother had them adopted. And we didn't want to upset you, so we just told you that they died. In a
Mm.
very, very matter of fact, cold and disconnected way. And then I started to just cry because it's like somebody telling you that you're not crazy, that there was some truth to what you knew.
Who am I?
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 This is Who Am I, Really? A podcast about adoptees that have located and connected with their biological family members.
I'm Damon Davis, and you're about to meet Virginia. She spoke to me from New York. When Virginia was young, her single mother struggled to raise her and her two young brothers, battled addiction and mental illness, and their family was separated. Virginia was reunited with her mom, but not her brothers, and she was crushed by the terrible news that she would never see them again. As an adult, she could feel something wasn't right about the story of her young brothers, so she went on a mission to uncover the truth. Virginia is not adopted, but her brothers were. This is Virginia's journey. Virginia was born in the Bronx, New York, to teenaged parents. The young couple had 3 children back to back. Virginia was born first, then her 2 younger brothers followed. She doesn't know what happened, but her parents separated and her mother took the children and moved away. Struggling to make her life work, her young mother placed the children in the care of a friend of her family out on Long Island, paying for her kids while she tried to get her life together. Virginia was only in the 1st grade, her brother was in kindergarten, and her youngest was at home in care.
At some point, I was removed from that home and brought back to live with my mother. And I lived with my mother for a little while until my mother had a nervous breakdown and she attempted suicide. So then I had to go live with my grandmother. Meanwhile, my 2 brothers were still in Long Island. As far as I knew, that's where they were. And it was a matter of time before we would be reunited again. And then when my mother came out of the hospital, we were living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I would start to ask her questions about my brothers. Can I write them letters? When can we go visit? When can they visit us? And stuff like that. And my mother never really knew how to address it. So her mother, my grandmother, told her to tell me that my brothers were killed in a car accident. So she sat me down one day and she told me that I couldn't write letters or I wasn't ever going to see them again because they were killed in a car accident. And I remember being very upset. I remember crying and being very upset. However, that was the story that I grew up with. I had 2 brothers who were killed in a car accident. I never really thought about the fact that my mother and father weren't together. I knew that that was back in the day when single parenthood was considered very unusual. So I knew that my upbringing was a little different, but I didn't really think about any of that stuff growing up because you don't when you're a child.
Yeah.
However, when I became a teenager, I'd start asking my mother questions about my young childhood. And my mother would never be able to talk to me about it because she'd start to cry and she would tell me that it's too upsetting. She can't talk about it. And my mother was also an alcoholic and I think she was a drug addict at times and she had some bouts of depression. So I was always very concerned with whether or not my mother was okay because she was all I had. So we developed that typical child of an alcoholic where my my biggest job in life was to take care of my mother, make sure that she was okay so that she could continue to take care of me.
So you had a role reversal. This is, a
Yes.
woman who's an adult who's supposed to be caring for you, but unfortunately, between probably the emotional challenge of separating from your father, the substance abuse, the loss of her children into another home, the breakup of her family was really challenging her emotionally. And here you are having to be the mature person, even though you're the child.
Yeah, I perceived my mother as weak and unable to handle a lot of challenges in life. So, for instance, I learned early on not to ask her questions about my younger years or my brothers or my father or anything like that. So, it was like an agreement that we just didn't talk about those things.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so when she came out of the hospital, you were brought back into the home with her, and
Yes.
the two of you lived with her mother, your grandmother. Is that right?
No, we got an apartment. Back then, it was easy to get an apartment. So I think my
Mhm.
grandmother had got her an apartment. And so we both moved into the apartment. I remember I have a vivid memory of my grandmother picking me up from school one day, and my mother was in the back seat of the car. My mother was in Bellevue Hospital. She was there for a couple of months, and they gave her shock therapy to bring her out of her depression. So what I came to learn was that she ended up surrendering her 2 sons, my brothers, for adoption, and she had such a difficult time with having made that decision that she tried to kill herself.
Oh,
So
wow. But you
then
learned
what
that much later, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
when she told me I thought they were still alive and living in Long Island, and then when she told me that they died, then that just put a stop in everything that came to my brothers. There was no talking about it. There was a finality to it. So
Yeah.
I always knew I was the oldest of 3 children, but and if people ever asked, I always say I was raised as an only child. But people who know me well, they know that I had 2 brothers until I was 5, and then my mother had another baby when I was 16, but from the ages of 5 to 16, I was raised as an only child.
Virginia's mother went on to have other relationships after her hospitalization, some of which were tumultuous. Virginia saw various men enter and exit their lives until her mother got remarried when she was 12 years old. When Virginia was 15 years old, her mother announced she was pregnant, and the baby was born when Virginia was 16.
I was totally thrilled that she was having another baby. I felt like she was having the baby for me, and whereas I didn't really get along with my stepfather a whole lot. He provided stability to the family. So, against typical experiences, my teenage years were probably some of the best and most stable years of my childhood because we didn't move around. We stayed in the same place. I stayed in the same schools. I had the same friends. My mother and stepfather had an active social life with neighbors and friends, and I was thoroughly in love with my little sister. She was the beginning and end of everything in my life. So I felt really good about life at that time.
Virginia said she always knew she wanted to be a mother, and she had her first child when she was 20 years old, her second when she was 23. Virginia and her husband separated, but when she was about 26 years old, her children were around the ages of 3 and 5, and her mind focused on her younger brothers more than she ever had before.
One of the things that I have come to learn over the years is that the truth is always available to us. It's just a question of when we're able to look at it, when we're able to see it, when we're able to accept it, when we're able to inquire about it. So when my children were the ages of 3 and 5, I started thinking about my brothers a lot. They just became, they just came to like the forefront of my consciousness, and I started realizing that the story that my mother told me never made any sense. Like,
Mm.
how did 2 children just die? There's no cemetery, there's no gravesite, there's
Oh,
no
yeah,
inf
she told you they were deceased, but you never went and visited any kind of
Right, yeah.
funeral.
Yeah, there was no talk about how they died or anything. So, I just was thinking and I was in therapy at the time, so I was talking to my therapist about this. And I decided one day, I called up my grandmother, my mother's mother, and I called her up and I said, "I need to come over. I want to talk to you." And I was coming without the kids. So she already knew that this wasn't like a visit, that I had to ask her something. So I went over and I asked her, I need to know what happened with my brothers. And almost immediately, first she tried to say, I don't know what you're talking about. But then she gave it up right away and said, they were adopted. Your mother had them adopted. And we didn't want to upset you. So we just told you that they died. In a
Mm.
very matter of fact, cold and disconnected way. And then I started to just cry because it's like somebody telling you that you're not crazy, that there was some truth to what you knew.
Yeah,
And
that is surreal. Oh my gosh.
yeah, yeah.
Then who was it that helped you through that time in your life?
So I had two best friends that were living in an apartment just a few buildings down from me. And when I left my grandmother's house, I just remember now what I know is that I was in a state of shock. But at the time I didn't realize. I remember that I had this tunnel vision, that my hearing was muffled. I was disconnected from my body. And I was at my girlfriend's house and I was sitting in the kitchen and one girlfriend said something to me and I overreacted to something she said. And then she said, "What is wrong with you?" And then my other girlfriend said, "Don't talk to her like that. She just got finished finding out something about her life." And when I
What?
yelled at my other girlfriend, I got up and I left the kitchen and I actually went into the hallway of the building because I was getting ready to leave. But my other girlfriend came out and we sat down on the steps and I was crying. I was talking about how can this be? And I always knew. And I was just babbling and I just broke down crying and sobbing and mumbling, and I was going on and on, and my one girlfriend, she just basically sat with me and held me and listened to everything I had to say and really seemed to understand that I was in a crisis, I would say, basically in a crisis. So she just basically held me and sat with me while I got it all out of me, so to speak. And she'll always have a special place in my heart for being the one to be there for me and helping me through that time because I don't know what I would have done. I don't know how I would have functioned if I wasn't able to have like that, like cathartic
Release.
upheaval. Yeah,
Yeah.
release. Exactly. That's a good way to talk about it. That release. So, and I don't know what would have happened to me. Because
Yeah.
it was too much to swallow. It was too much to be able to act as if it didn't happen. And again, I was in therapy at the time, so I was able to talk about it all through therapy and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
That's really great. Wow. Yeah, this isn't something that can just roll off your shoulders like, nah,
Right.
I do it. And you're just going to keep going. That's a huge deal. That must have been incredibly rough to think to yourself that not only had your mother, but your grandmother had conspired against you in the truth, completely underestimating what a child can handle, right?
Yeah.
That they led you
Yeah.
to believe that these boys that you loved were deceased versus leaving you with the notion that they may be okay and out in the
Right.
world somewhere, and that eventually there may be hope for you to find them, but just cutting you off from their very existence. That's pretty cruel. Can I ask before I go further, did she say to you anything along the lines of, I wanted to tell you, I thought you should know, or any like regret around having lied about their
No, she
existence?
she copped to it. She said, I told your mother to because my mother was so weak. Her mother was able to bully her in a lot of ways, and that was the nature of their relationship. So my grandmother, almost with pride, she said, "Well, I told her to tell you that they were dead because you were asking about them, and I just thought that was the easiest way." We didn't. She said things like, "We didn't know that it wasn't good to lie to children back then." She just basically said that, "Yeah, that's what I told her to tell you, and that's what she told you."
Yeah,
And
so it
then
was
when
no, it's like, yeah, that's what happened and that's what it is. It
yeah,
doesn't sound like she had remorse for it at all. Interesting. Wow.
no, she didn't appear to have remorse at all. There's a lot of complications all through my childhood. There's so many addendums to my story that are not about this adoption, but this is such an important topic for me because I just lived with that knowledge, and I was a single parent, and I was just going day by day myself.
Even with the knowledge that her brothers were still alive, Virginia's life at the time was focused on the day to day management of her young family as a single mother. Along the way, she decided that she wanted to locate her father. So, in those pre internet days, Virginia combed through the phone book and started calling people inquiring about the man. Virginia even contacted a private investigator, and within 2 hours of leaving his office, the PI had found her father. He was still in the New York area with his siblings, which made him easy to locate. Finding him tangentially unlocked a new set of knowledge for Virginia.
And so I reconnected with my father first. And then when I reconnected with my father, he told me about all of the family members that were around. And then I guess my cousin got my name and phone number, and it turned out we lived within 30 minutes from each other. I had moved upstate by then, and she was upstate, and it was just it just blew our minds that we were both living upstate and that we were like 30 minutes from each other. And so I went to her house, I brought my kids, and through her, I reconnected with everybody on my father's side. She was 9 or 10 years older than me, and she had vivid memories of her entire childhood. She's one of those kids. She remembers conversations that adults had. She remembers everybody. So she remembered me and she remembered my two brothers. And she was an integral part of my healing as well because she could tell me about myself as a very young child.
Wow.
And one of the things that she always reiterated to me was that I was a caretaker to my younger brothers. She said it like this. She said, if somebody gave you a cookie, you broke it into 3 pieces and gave each of your brothers a piece and you had a
Wow.
piece. That's how I took care of my brothers and how much they meant to me. Because it was a chaotic situation. My mother and my birth father were very violent and always tumultuous. And then at some point, like I said, she just left him. So when she told me that, it also put a piece of the puzzle together for me also, because I always felt like I had a hole in my heart that was empty. And it was because of the separation of me and my two brothers. I didn't have that longing for my father. I didn't have that longing for anybody else. But when it came to my brothers, I never felt whole. I never felt complete. I never felt like I always felt something was missing. And I was in therapy. I've been in therapy my whole life, but at the time of my therapy, when I was 39, I was starting to look at some of the trauma of my childhood. And cousin being able to tell me things validated for me what I always knew, that they were special to me, that they meant a lot to me. And she also validated, your mother just picked up and moved. Nobody knew where she went. She just disappeared.
Wow. How did it hit you when you heard this description of yourself as being so selfless, as parenting your older brothers, equally distributing resources between you as a caregiver to them? What did it feel like to hear this description of yourself as a young child?
Well, I was beginning to understand about what it meant to be a child of an alcoholic. I was beginning to understand even through my 20s. I used to go to Al-Anon meetings. I used to go to specialized Al-Anon meetings that were specifically for adult child of alcoholics. As I say, I was in therapy. I knew that my mother and I had an unhealthy relationship, but we still continue the dynamic of me taking care of her emotionally. I could never rely on her emotionally to be there. So
Yeah.
I never I never looked towards her for support and stuff like that. And then years later, when I became a nurse and then a substance use counselor, I really learned how my whole life was about healing and helping and aiding in the recovery of other people because that's what I knew in my bones.
Yeah, that's
That's the
really
way I grew
interesting.
up. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how you grew up, and then your life turned into that kind of service for others. That's actually really an powerful insight. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So the whole entire trajectory of my life was a healing process from my childhood, basically, and my
Mhm,
young adult years. As my
mhm.
father was one of 6 siblings, and I reconnected with everybody. And I could write a book about that thing. Let me tell you, I could just
I
write a
think
book
that you
about
could
that
too.
alone and nothing else. Having been raised in a very bohemian, moving around a lot
Yeah.
lifestyle to then connecting with a whole bunch of Italian Catholics from the Bronx. That was like a whole nother thing.
Virginia's father was easy to find, but he wasn't much help regarding her brothers. He was emotionally unavailable, didn't have much to share, and took no responsibility for the narrative of Virginia's childhood. So she started the quest to find her brothers by registering on adoption websites. Virginia didn't have the boys' names, but she knew their birth dates. Unfortunately, the sites didn't yield any results. Virginia went to the New York Public Library to search for birth certificates, but she didn't find any useful information there either. Since a private investigator had been so effective before, Virginia sought another PI to help her search, but the prices were not cheap. Her cousin, who had been so supportive of her reunion, loaned Virginia the money, which she committed to paying back. After giving the investigator all of the information they had, he called back in 3 days with Virginia's brothers' names, shared where they were living, and had some uniquely identifying information about them. Her brothers had been adopted into a German family. One brother's given name was retained by the family, the other brother's name had been changed. Either way, Virginia wanted to speak with the men whom she hadn't seen since they were young boys. I was curious how it felt, after so many years of knowing her brothers were alive, to be preparing to speak to each of them.
It felt wonderful. I just remember saying to my therapist, because I was in therapy all through this, she was very supportive of me. And you know how therapists are. You tell a therapist something, and they go, okay, how did that make you feel? And so you have to talk about it. So through the process, I mean, I felt good. I felt like I was an adult taking charge of my life and that I was correcting some of the mistakes that had been made. I was getting information and knowledge of questions that I had. I felt really good about it. I mean, I knew that we weren't all young children anymore. So I think I knew we weren't going to be able to connect completely, pick up where we left off, so to speak. You can't do that. But it was very liberating. It was very empowering. It was very healing for me.
Yeah,
So
that's really
I was
incredible. So tell me about this first conversation. Which brother did you speak with first, and how was it?
So I spoke to Alan first, and I don't have a vivid memory of exactly what we talked about because I think it was just asking questions. I was asking questions about his where he lived, his family, who he was adopted by, what his childhood was like. He didn't really have a memory of his life before he was adopted, but at some point his parents told him that he was adopted. So he knew he was adopted, but he didn't know anything about it. All he knew was his I don't know why he knew that. I think they just told him. And it was a very strict German family. His parents were very strict German couple who didn't allow for a lot of questions and stuff like that. So him and his brother were raised in a very strict family. His parents
Mhm.
were older, which is why I think one of the reasons why they couldn't go through the official adoption process. I came to find out it was basically I used to call it a black market adoption, but basically they were stolen from my mother. And I
Really?
think that there were some lawyers and some people that made some money off of that whole process. Feel like my mother was a victim of some unscrupulous people who saw that she was struggling and saw a way to benefit off of her struggles and somehow were able to manipulate my mother to think that this was the best thing for her to do. So she
How
felt
what makes
she
you
felt
say that? How what
yeah.
tell me about what you've learned that makes you realize these were some of the details of the situation? What do you know?
Well, there's no paper trail. There's no paper trail whatsoever.
Yeah,
There's
so
no
would indicate
yeah.
an intentional hiding of
Yes.
the process. I see what you're saying. Go ahead.
Yeah, and the person that I think was instrumental in doing this was my mother's boyfriend, and he had since died. So, he wasn't somebody that I looked for him to ask him questions, but he had since passed away, and so he wasn't available. So, I don't know why I didn't think I could go back to my grandmother. I certainly couldn't talk to my mother about it. And so but when I connected with my younger brother and he just, like I say, there was no paper trail. There was no, there was an acknowledgement that they were adopted, but it wasn't like it was an open adoption. It wasn't like, oh yeah, you were adopted and your mother and sister they were in New Jersey. Or your mother and sister live in New York or anything like that. So they were just focusing on their own lives. And they weren't a close family, so when I met my younger brother, his mother had already passed, and his father was in a nursing home with dementia, so he couldn't even go to his adoptive parents and ask any questions.
Oh, really? Wow. That's too bad.
He was very open and accepting and loving in a way that it wasn't all like touchy-feely stuff, but he was interested in getting to know me and learning about what I remembered about our childhood. And I had pictures of him before he was adopted, and he was always interested in seeing those pictures. However, he wasn't, he didn't, he wasn't interested in meeting his birth mother or birth father or anything
Yeah.
like that.
And so this brother that you met first was your youngest brother, the one you spoke with
Yes,
and met. Gotcha.
yes.
Gotcha. And then tell me about meeting your middle brother, or let's talk about calling him and connecting with him. What were you feeling going into that, and how was that first conversation? Do you recall?
Well, I don't really remember my feelings going into it. I do remember calling him. My younger brother told me that while he spoke to his older brother from time to time, that they weren't close. And so his name was Victor. So Victor went into the military at a young age, and he ended up settling in the Midwest. And so I called him and I told him who I was, and he said he said, "Okay," and he appeared to be interested. However, he was unable, while he did tell me he remembered, he had a vivid memory of riding in the backseat of a car with Alan, and he remembered hearing on the radio. I'm sorry, my cats are going crazy. He remembered hearing on the radio that JFK was shot.
Oh, wow.
So that was like a timestamp, 1963, and that made sense. And so not only did he know he was adopted, he did have a memory. He didn't have a memory of before his life, the adoption, but he does have that first memory of riding in the car. But he was unable to have an in-depth discussion about it. He would make small talk with me. For instance, I would say things like, "So what has your life been like?" Or "Why did you settle in the Midwest?" Or whatever. And he would just start talking about the price of groceries. Or I'd ask him about his military experience. And he went all over the world, and I'd ask him what that was like. He visited parts of Africa and Asia, and so what was that like? I would just ask questions, and it was really difficult for him to really connect emotionally on any level.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Sounds like he blocked out a lot of what he had been through, right? The
Yeah.
notion that his parents were pretty strict, that he was the older of the two boys when they were adopted, and probably has some deep recollection of being separated from your family and moving into this other family and all of the tumult that preceded that separation. Like, he may not be able to access it, but I'm sure it's in there, which is partially why I suspect he's not, he chooses not to or is not able to emotionally access those pieces of your history or his personal past. That's really fascinating. So you said that you're not close with either of them now. Is that right?
So so I had a few conversations with Victor, my older brother, and it became pretty apparent to me that there was not going to be a coming together or a reconnecting. Or he was very religious, and he lived a very religious life, and he became a born again Christian. So he would talk to me about that, which I had there was no common ground. So, but he would talk about how he was living his life, and church was a big part of his life. And he basically told me in so many words that if I wasn't a born again Christian, that he just didn't see the value in having a relationship with me.
Yeah.
And I was
If you
okay
weren't,
with that by that point.
so he's saying if you weren't religiously aligned with him, there was really no point to you guys being in touch.
Yeah, because he wasn't close to his brother. The father was in a nursing home, and I think he'd visit him, but there was no closeness there. He was just living he created a life for himself where he was living that gave him comfort.
Yeah.
And I was okay with that. I just didn't see how I fit into that at all.
I
So
understand.
I knew that wasn't gonna be. However, with my younger brother, we did continue to build a relationship. And I actually introduced him to his birth father. I had them both over the house once. And so I've visited and met with my Alan a whole bunch of times. But at this point, now we're talking almost 30 years later, we stay in touch on Facebook. I send him birthday cards and Christmas cards. I I did the 23andMe or Ancestry.com a couple of years ago, and I said to him that I was go that he should do it also, just to find out about our ethnic background, and he said he thought that would be very interesting, but he never did it. So he never married and had children, but he also created a life for himself where he was content, he was happy, he had things going on in his life that were rewarding to him. He had a special relationship, he had a good job.
He's living a rich life. Yeah.
Yeah, so he met with my father. That was very anticlimactic. My father was a very cold-hearted person and never took responsibility for anything. So it was like, it wasn't my father and my younger brother look exactly alike. So that was very surreal. Being in the living room and watching the two of them talking about sports or the weather or whatever. And I'm sitting there looking at the both of them. And I'm like, you're meeting your son that you haven't seen since he was 3 years old. And you don't have any questions for him? I'm like, these people, like, I don't understand these people.
Yeah. Really crazy.
But
It's
people do what they need to do to cope, right? So,
That's what I was gonna say. That's
yeah.
right. They were just both trying to get through. They were avoiding the tough stuff. They didn't want to deal with any of it. Wow. May I ask, Virginia, how did you talk about this journey of finding your brothers and connecting and calling them and all this stuff with your mom?
So I went to her house. I don't think I had found them yet. And I sat my mother down and I said, I have something to tell you because I was still perpetuating the dynamic that I had to take care of my mother. So I sat her down and I said to her, I know what happened with my brothers. And this must have been after I found them because I remember saying to her, and I found them. And right away she said to me, I don't want to know anything about it. So I don't know if this was before or after. I don't know if she was still drinking then. Yeah, and she must have still been drinking because she became a very different person when she got into recovery. And I think the conversation would have went very different. But
Mm.
she never brought it up again. And I never brought it up again. I also reconnected my mother and father. I had my mother came to visit me and she was staying with me, and my father came over to visit. So I was like the reconnector of the family. Like, not
Yeah.
only that, I was like my mission in life to put all these people back together again. So,
That's funny.
whereas my father always told me that he never stopped loving my mother. And of course, he took no responsibility for the breakup. And he never took responsibility for the not finding me and, and connecting with me. His thing always
Mhm.
was, "You never reached out." And there were times that I'd start screaming at him. I was a child.
You're
Where's
the
your
adult.
responsibility? Yeah. He never took responsibility for any of that. He was always, and it's just the way he lived his life. But then, so I had them both over at the house. It was probably around the same era, the same time when I had my brother and him over at the same time. And they were very flirty with each other, and there was a lot of laughing and a lot of giggling, but that was the end of that. And so I after that, so since then my mother has passed, my father has passed, and my younger brother Alan and I just we're just like we're Facebook friends, and we message each other. Like I say, it's one of those relationships where you feel close to the person. I feel close to him, he feels close to me, but we lead very different lives, so it's not like our lives interject. And I send him, you know, on his birthday, I'll send him a birthday message, thinking about you, hoping you're well, and he'll respond, I always think about you, and stuff like that. So it's like that. I always feel like I should do more to reach out to him, but I don't know why I don't. Because that whole process closed up that hole I had in my heart. I finally started to feel more whole and more complete. And I spent the next decades really working on healing myself. I went from that therapist to another therapist who was very informed in complex PTSD and did a
Uh-huh.
lot of work with me around that. I did so much work around that with that therapist. And so my life was focused on raising my children, my career, and my healing journey.
That's amazing. I love to hear that. I'm always interested in how people have
Yeah.
gone through some level of healing, and that's really incredible to hear that you did that. And I liked what you said about the fact that you got what you needed. You filled the hole. You may not have a super close or tight relationship with your brothers right now, but that just is what it is. But you've satisfied that piece of yourself that knew they were out there. You've made the connections. You've figured out loosely what happened with them, and the hole is closed. And it may not be the entirely fulfilling sort of amazing reunification that many people hope for out of a Disney movie, but you got
It's
what you
never
needed.
like a Disney movie. I don't care what people say. You see these
Exactly.
I was so possessed with all the stories I would read and see on Oprah and all the other TV shows about finding families, and they'd always show people running slow motion to each other and crying. And I always knew that was BS, that you could maybe that did happen from time to time, but I think I even heard Oprah do an interview once where she said she had to stop doing those shows because they weren't coming out like she was hoping they would come out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
That's right. It's easy to sensationalize a moment, but the
Yes.
trajectory of the entire storyline gets lost, right? So you can sensationalize this slow motion running hug piece, but it doesn't give any fair, balanced reporting on all of the trauma, for example, that you had in your life in the beginning. It doesn't go into what happened after that first call, where you guys have realized, like, we're super different. There's probably not going to be much here in terms of relationship. So I think it's important for everybody to recognize that the sensationalism of these moments in time is not an accurate reflection of the full reality of what people go through. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, and this is why listening to your show is so good, because you give voice to the voiceless and your own voice of your experience. You shine a light on what people are not willing to talk about, the lies, the deceit, the trauma. the abuse, the secrets. In 12 step, they say you're as sick as your secrets. And there were families that the secrets are so rampant, so intense, so heavy that these are sick families. And that is what needs to be talked about. That's what needs to be exposed. And it's not that adoption is a bad thing. I never blamed my mother for giving up her sons. I really saw her as a victim. I also wish that we live in a society, and there are other societies, not maybe not present societies, but I think maybe in some other societies where, when you have an entire tribe or community that come together to raise children, you don't run into these kind of problems. And you often hear stories like I adopted a teenager from Guatemala and learning about that whole culture. Many times, children are not raised by their birth parents. And the trauma is we can't talk about it. I don't have answers to your questions. That's where the trauma is. The damage that's done to children is the secrecy because children can handle anything if you love them and you tell them the truth and you tell them it's not their fault. It's not
I
because you
see.
were bad. It's not because you were too much trouble. It's because I love you so much. I wanted you to come live with me and stuff like that.
That's incredibly well said. You're absolutely right. The kids can handle the truth if you give it to them, obviously in age appropriate ways, but
Yeah.
the honesty is so much better than any level of deceit. Because this is what I tell my kids. You can lie to me and I understand. Like you might feel threatened in a situation and it might feel like I'm going to come down on you. But here's the thing. If you lie to me and then I figure it out, now I'm mad twice, right?
Yeah.
I'm mad at the fact that you did the thing or whatever you're lying about. And now I'm also
Yes.
mad at the fact that you led me to believe something that wasn't true. And that's what happens with these discussions about adoption and the traumas therein is in your instance, I would imagine you were sad and disappointed that you had been lied to, but now you've figured out like through this hole in your heart that there's a truth out there. You know what I mean? And so it's like it's a double-edged sword of not only did we take something from you, but we lied about it. It didn't say that you could handle it. Just imagine how differently you might have lived thinking about your brothers if you had just known that they're alive, they're
Hmm.
okay. You didn't lose them in a tragic car accident,
Hmm.
that presumably they are alive and okay, and you would have some level of hope for finding them versus feeling this thing in your gut going, I need to go have a hard conversation with my grandmother. Those are two very different scenarios in a person's life. Virginia has had an array of lived experiences. She is not adopted herself, but she endured the other side of adoption, having lost contact with her brothers when they were adopted out of the family at an early age. Virginia, ever the nurturer, who said she always wanted to foster or adopt, just told us she adopted one of her children internationally from Guatemala. Virginia tells the story of how she became an adoptive parent when her genetic children were grown and in college and the military, respectively. She had applied to Orange County Social Services to care for a teenaged child. At that point in her life, it would have been too hard to start all over again with young children as a single mother managing her career. Caring for an older child felt like the perfect situation. I found Virginia's approach admirable because, as you may know, the older a child gets, the less likely they are to be adopted. I asked Virginia how her experiences with her brother's adoptions impacted her as an adoptive parent.
So I remember I used to sit in the class that we were taking, and when I'd say I was looking for a teenager, people would say to me, "What are you crazy?" But to me, that seemed like the perfect situation, and the whole story played itself out. They called me late at night one night, and they told me that they had a 16-year-old girl who had a baby already, and they needed foster care. So I was thrilled out of my mind. And so I brought her into my home because I was prepared. I had the home study and everything done. And then she ended up getting pregnant again with her boyfriend. So we got very close because I didn't have any illusions about replacing her mother, but she was basically sold by her family, ended up in the United States, was was abused, and had a baby at 15, and found herself at 16 in the foster care system. So living with me and there was so much love that I gave her, that my two children gave her, my children's spouses gave her. I felt like I was creating the family that I always wanted because I just had a lot of love to give. So I showered her with a lot of love, and then her first child and I became very close because she had difficulty parenting her first child. And that first child just became 16 a couple of days
Wow.
ago. So I ended up taking over a lot of the emotional and daily care of the child because my daughter she was suffering from depression. She had a lot of trauma.
Yeah.
She needed to heal. And you can't parent a 16-year-old the way you do a 1-year-old. They're going to do what they're going to do. And
Yeah.
you just tell them that, okay, I love you, I support you, whatever. And we became very close. Her children call me abuela, which is Spanish for grandmother.
Yeah.
And that was just a very rewarding, amazing, wonderful time in my life. All of it, everything.
That's amazing. And you know what I'm hearing too is I'm thinking back to what your cousin said about you being this nurturer, right? This kid who divided resources among your siblings just and you've talked about your career in wanting to help people out of their most challenging life situations in your social service work and that you've said you had a lot of love in your heart to that you wanted to give and that it sounds like would have been wasted had you not had an opportunity to create a extended family with your daughter and now your grandkids. It just sounds like that's who you are, Virginia, which is really sweet to hear. Because a lot of times you've heard on the show, we talk about how some adoptees will tell you, my parents should have never been parents, right?
Oh,
They
yeah.
adopted me and I don't even know why they did it. Like they just were not parents. And so that is skewed towards the end of adopting out of pressure to appear to be something that you're not by having
Hmm.
children. But there's on the other side of that bell curve of why people adopt, just this feeling in your heart that you've got more to give and that someone else in need deserves an opportunity. And I love to hear that you were that kind of parent. That's really amazing. It's really awesome. So,
Well, I feel like our children are given to us to heal us. So I always say to people, especially if they're complaining about their children, I go, you don't get the child you want, you get the child you need. So
yeah.
if you think that a child is going to heal you or complete you or achieve the things that you never wanted to achieve and all of that stuff, you're going to be completely disappointed. But if you see a child as a means of growing and healing and becoming whole, then your children will be that for you. So I'm
Yeah.
sure that's been part of your experience as well. Because,
100%.
yeah.
Yeah, you've heard me probably joke on the show that I grew up on 80s, 90s hip hop culture and playing soccer and lacrosse. And my son, I thought was going to be this spitting image of me doing all the same things.
Uh-huh.
And he lives in a different generation with a different set of friends. And at this particular moment in time, he's a huge video gamer and he's like trying to learn to fly planes. Just a
Uh-huh.
completely different set of experiences than myself.
Who
And
would have
you're
thought it,
absolutely
right? The individuals. Who would have thought it?
they
The
really are. Yeah, you think you're gonna have this little twin that you're gonna get along with famously, and you end up with this individual, and you're like, "Where did
Yes,
he come from?" So it's kind of fun.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
really cool.
And if you recognize that without trying to suppress it, if you're able to say, how can I grow from this experience of my child? Then the work is laid out for you. You don't have to work so hard. It's already there.
That's right. Very true. Virginia, this has been wonderful to chat with you. I appreciate your time so much.
Thank you
So
for
thank you
giving
for
me
coming
a
forward.
voice and being able to share my story, even though it's not an adoption story, so to speak. I do feel like the whole sibling thing does get overlooked a lot.
It does. You're absolutely right. And I've often wondered what it would be like to interview someone who searched and found or was found by someone else. So I'm glad you stepped forward to share your story. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so sick.
Yeah.
You wanted it, and it came and appeared.
That's exactly right. So cool. Thanks for being here, Virginia.
Thank you so much.
Good
But
to
I'll,
meet-
I'll keep listening.
I love it. Thank you so much. Take care, Virginia.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Hey, it's me. Virginia was told as a young girl that her two younger brothers were killed. Imagine the kind of trauma that news inflicts on a child. Like so many adoptees can feel about the makeup of their own family, Virginia could feel that the narrative she was fed about her brothers didn't add up. Her sense that the family had a secret was similar to the feelings of many adoptees who feel like something is off in their family and they need to seek clear answers. I was glad to hear that her grandmother immediately came clean and admitted her brothers were still alive, and a private investigator was able to help her find the men and reconnect. But of course, as adults, with their own lives and different experiences than Virginia's, the siblings only connected as much as they could for where they were in their lives. She experienced what many adopted people do in locating long-lost family, opening the door to reunion connection, but not finding the other party is willing or able to cross the threshold to the other side. She said the reunion experience filled a hole in her heart, and it's clear to me that Virginia is a giver, a supportive, loving woman, and someone who will always give a piece of herself to others. I think we need more people like Virginia in our world. I'm Damon Davis, and I hope you found something in Virginia's story that inspired you, validates your feelings about wanting to search, or motivates you to have the strength along your journey to learn, who am I really?